Hey, everybody. It is just after high noon on May 25th, 2022. We are just roughly 24 hours after what we now know is one of the deadliest school shootings in American history. Using that sort of description is difficult at this time, not only because of the content of the news, but there's still so much that we don't know about this event. And we know that there are many that are still being treated at the hospital. So we're jumping into this story with an update, knowing full well that we have a lot of information to continue to gather. We have some facts confirmed, but we have many others that are not confirmed at this time. I wanted to talk to you directly for a few different reasons. One, I think 24 hours after this event is an appropriate time to pause for us to collect ourselves and see what we know, what we don't know, why that matters. I also want to talk to you a little bit about my experience covering school shootings, as awful as they are, because I think that'll help us all understand why this is a difficult story to piece together. What are some of the obstacles that the press and the public are dealing with together? And then I want to talk to you about some of my past reporting experience in Israel. And the reason why I want to talk to you about Israel is a country, when we talk about which countries have school shootings and which countries do not, Israel is a country that has very few school shootings. And that may surprise you considering that we do hear about violence in that part of the world. So why? Why do they have so few school shootings? That's something I explored in my reporting in the past. I think those are some interesting things that we could at least talk a little bit about while also maintaining focus on the victims here at this particular event. So we're 24 hours after it. We know that there's going to be press conferences coming today. Even if you watch this a few days from now, I think this will be informative to think about what we knew at 24 hours and maybe what we have now known as the story develops. Around 12:30 Central Time, so just 30 minutes from now, we expect a press conference in Uvalde. And this is going to involve a lot of high-profile officials and politicians, including the governor, Senators Cruz and Cornyn, the state representatives as well. I'm hopeful that we'll get more information at this time, but I also want to caution us that as far as getting confirmed information from local law enforcement, we haven't received a lot of confirmation from the local law enforcement yet. A lot of the information we've been dealing with as part of the press has come from the governor's office, for example. We know that the governor was early reporting the number of fatalities in this incident and that those fatalities went up. So I want to caution us on that. We have to consider the source. So let's just do a big overview of where we are at this time. As I was looking up Uvalde, Texas, which is about 2.5 hours from where I'm sitting right now, just outside of Austin. It's taking everything within my power not to want to get in the car and drive there. I don't know what I would do when I was there. I'd want to report, but I think there's that feeling as any American citizen to just go and try to help and think about these families that are most affected. But just to orient you into where we're talking about in the world. So we're about a 90-minute drive from San Antonio. We're about a 90-minute drive from the border. Uvalde has a sweet website talking about the history of the city that I thought was special because we talk about small towns being at the crossroads of America. Uvalde says it sits at the crossroads literally of America because U.S. highways 83 and 90 cross in the middle of town. And these highways go from Canada to Mexico and Florida to California. So they crisscross the nation and they come right through this small town of Uvalde. Uvalde says that they're also the crossroads of cultures, with our language and customs being a mix of Mexican, Spanish, English, and German elements. And they talk about the Spanish trails that run through the area, the Native American trails that run north and south along their rivers. So there's a clear, very proud culture in Uvalde, a very unique culture that considers itself really at the crossroads of America. And so yesterday, around this time, the entire country and the rest of the world started to hear some reports of what happened. So what I'm going to do now is just play through what we know happened, knowing that we're still getting some pieces of this puzzle. And one of the things I wrote down as I was preparing for this is this statement: we know so little. We know so little. We know around 11:30 Central Time that a gunman, an 18-year-old, went into the elementary school at some point after shooting his grandmother. The grandmother is key to this, by the way. We don't really know whether she was the primary target Was she trying to stop him from going to the school? Was the school his real target? How did this all evolve? We know there's a lot of chaos surrounding what happened in the moments before the shooting at the elementary school. We don't have a lot of clarity on this. Over the last 24 hours, you might have noticed that the grandmother was reported deceased, then reported in the hospital. So again, this is going to be key of figuring out the timeline, which we still have a very, very rough timeline at this very moment. We know the gunman entered the school. You're going to have some news organizations reporting the gunman's name, showing his face. That's not something that we do at Smarter News. Some news agencies prefer not to name the shooter. I think that's appropriate here at this moment. If you'd like to know more about him, I'm sure you can find out that information and confirmation. I think that's probably the least important thing is his names. And what we're trying to understand are the confirmed names of the victims, which we also don't have at this time. We're getting some brand new information from a member of the Texas Department of Public Safety. He apparently is one of the people that's really a point person as far as a spokesperson for this particular event. So although I don't have local law enforcement, I can quote him and how he's describing what happened inside the school. And we're learning now that there was a fourth grade class where the gunman went and barricaded himself inside the room. That created a challenge for law enforcement because they could not enter the room, and it created a room full of victims for the gunman. And apparently most of the victims, as we now know it from the Texas Department of Public Safety, occurred in this fourth grade classroom. He also confirmed, this is Lieutenant Christopher Olivares, he confirmed that the identities of these students have now been confirmed. That was not the case earlier this morning. In fact, law enforcement cautioned the public and cautioned families that full identification could take some time because of the need for DNA evidence. And let me just pause right there for a moment. That's tough to take in. We obviously are all seeing pictures of young children, and you know that parents are missing their children. And you think, well, why can't they be identified? Well, there is certainly a process with law enforcement, especially with the crime scene. It takes longer than any of us would wish. But this may provide some insight, unfortunately, to the violence and to the close range of the shooting if identities were all not immediately available. So I just want to leave that there. But Lieutenant Christopher Olivares says that at least the families all know. I would expect that although you'll see news agencies start to identify different victims, it's going to take a while. We'll see. We'll see when we get the names. The other thing I think is really important here, and that was mentioned very early in this event, was injuries. We know that there are some injuries, but we don't really have a number for how many. We don't really know how serious. And I just want us to remain aware of that storyline. While news organizations are chasing numbers, we know that there are some really serious injuries. We could have more people, unfortunately, or children pass away. We also know that these injuries could be devastating and affect them for the rest of their lives. So we need to remain sensitive to that. And I just want to make sure that we know that that is something that took place. So at this point, we know a little bit about the who. We don't really know anything about the motive. In general, as a pattern of school shootings or mass shootings, as we've talked about, unfortunately, recently, there is overwhelmingly consistency among the shooters that they telegraph their actions in some way. The Wall Street Journal and others have apparently been able to source some of the shooters' social media pages. That is very difficult for us to independently verify, but that's going to be a key part to this puzzle as well. What we're really looking for here is not only primary sources, but we want a double source. We want a double and triple source. We want to start seeing consistency in information to really understand some of the particulars of this case. Why does that really matter? Why does motive matter? It's hard for all of us, isn't it, at this moment where all that seems to matter is the children. And we know that that is true, right? The children and the victims in this. But with the conversation in the national press and otherwise going in a lot of different directions, understanding what's the issues here, when exactly the shooter purchased a weapon, it appears that he purchased 2 rifles within the last week or so. Understanding how he telegraphed perhaps his actions or his intentions, understanding the mental health part of this will be very useful in informing our conversations moving forward. So we don't have the why. We don't have the why. We know the when, we know the where. We know most of the who, but we don't know the why. And the why is always the part of the story that always bedevils us the most. Even if we know why, sometimes we can't fully explain it. So these are the parts of the story that I just want us to be aware of. We're going to continue to watch for identifications of victims. We're going to continue to piece together the crime. We're going to continue to watch the injuries. And we're also going to see what is the picture that comes up as to what actually transpired in the days and weeks leading up into this particular event. The Wall Street Journal did mention in one of their past reports that there was some potential connection between the grandmother and the elementary school. But again, we can't verify that. And that, again, is a piece of the puzzle that I'd really like to know a little bit more about. So that's where we stand. I'd like to share with you now a little bit about an experience covering a school shooting, the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, and how that informed me as a journalist, because I think that will be helpful here. And unfortunately, we're getting these very dark comparisons between these two events for obvious reasons. Sandy Hook was the deadliest school shooting in American history. Before that time, even thinking about an entire classroom being affected by a school shooter wasn't something that came up in the news cycle. Now, unfortunately, we talk a lot more about school shootings. We see them with more frequency, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the data. But I just want to share something that I did. It was a mistake that I made actually in my career that I think could be helpful for understanding, well, why can't we get more information? Why can't we gather it all at the same time? In part, it's just trying to organize the information in a way that makes sense to be able to report. On that day, when we heard about the Sandy Hook shooting, it was right before I got on live television. So a couple minutes before we were going live on air, we have an entire show planned. And then suddenly we hear about a shooting in Connecticut. So we're live, New York City, we're national news. And this news is now getting more and more attention. We're seeing helicopter video. We know something happened at this school, but the early reports there were of a teacher or some sort of staff member shooting themselves in the foot. That was the first report. Someone discharged a weapon and police are responding. It was very confusing. Then it goes from that to there being two shooters on the loose. And we get the helicopter shot. Everyone's going around the area looking for these two shooters. Then we get to a point, now we've been on air for, let's say, an hour and a half. And during this time, you're not taking commercial breaks. You're trying to talk to different law enforcement sources. You're in many ways flying just as blind as anybody who's just trying to get the information as it comes in. And I remember that first responders laid out these large mats. These are mats that are laid out at any sort of emergency. And the intention is that you would put different people on these different colored mats in order to show the severity of their injuries. And that way you could treat them accordingly. You would prioritize the ones that are the most injured, and then you would work your way down to the ones that are the least injured. And so we were staring at these mats for a long time. And I remember distinctly saying something on air to the effect, and this was my mistake. I said, well, we're not seeing any injuries. Perhaps that means no one is injured. I mean, it sounds like an obvious statement, doesn't it? But there was the other consideration that there was no one injured to help aid. And that was the realization that came a short time afterwards, that there were no injuries because these students had been murdered. And I want you to pay close attention to the language. When we talk about the school shootings, we talked about people that are killed. We often don't say that they're murdered. And I think actually using that term is actually more helpful because they have in fact been murdered. This is a crime. They were intentionally killed. And so this is different than another random act. So that was a hard lesson for me because that event just spanned the possibilities from an accidental shooting of someone's foot to the worst school shooting in American history. I remember driving out to Sandy Hook Elementary School in the early mornings. It was probably about 4:00 in the morning. I'd worked all day, and then we were able to go and be on location. And it was anything that you would ever imagine about a horrific breaking news scene, because not only do you have the families grieving, you have the entirety of the international press present in the parking lot. And there's this desire, and I think there is always a desire in the press to cover the story the best that we can. But then there's also that thin line of exploitation that I'm sure a lot of you are also feeling now too, which is the hyper focus, the hyper partisanship that tends to surface in the aftermath of these events almost instantly. And I would argue, as someone that's worked in 24-hour news, and I'll give you my perspective on this because I do like to share my commentary on journalism, is that when you have these endless hours to fill, that breeds a lot of ground to go into hypothetical situations and speculation. And we're going to have a lot of political debates because we can't fill that time with facts, but we can fill it with debate or theories. And that gets dangerous because what we do want to stay focused on in these sort of events, and really, quite frankly, any news story, is we want to stay focused on the facts. So even that small description of what happened with Sandy Hook, I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into behind the scenes. We only have movies, most of us, as context, or we're able to see an event and replayed on a news magazine show or read about it in its entirety. But when it's actually happening and people are searching for information, the chaos is very difficult to describe. And so that's why we have to stay very disciplined and close to the who, what, where, when, how, and why. And that's what I try to do with Smarter News. And that's what we're trying to do today. So last thing I want to leave you with, because you are going to hear a lot of speculation. You're already getting flooded with information about gun laws and policy. The president talked a little bit about that last night. So it's not just because of the news. You have politicians instantly coming out and talking about it. You're going to be hearing about the assault rifle ban that took place at one point in 1994 to 2004. You're going to be hearing a lot about gun laws and policies and background checks and all of that. I promise you, we will get there when it's appropriate. Right now, it's a lot of talk. What are lawmakers actually considering? What could actually be a possibility? What actually has the political will from both parties is another question entirely. And I really think that needs to be underscored as well. So one of the things that I was able to do in the past, and I want to mention that this was several years ago, so there may be updates to this, but I can't help but think a little bit about it. One of the things the news is supposed to do is not only cover the facts, but cover new information, right? It's the news. So it's not just about recycling old conversations or allowing old theories to come up yet again and having the same conversations that we've had in the past. It's also about, well, what new ideas are out there? What are new theories out there? What are new things that we can talk about that can enrich our coverage of this actual event? And so this is what I'm going to do here in this segment of our talk. I was able to report in Israel. So Israel, obviously a region of the world, is in the region of the world where there's a lot of violence. Israel is surrounded by many countries that at one point or still don't want Israel to exist as a Jewish state. You have a lot of tension between regions, religion, ethnic background, people. This violence comes out into the streets in Israel. There are also a lot of debates about who's problematic in this and why does the violence take place. That's not what I'm going to be talking about here. What I am going to be talking about is school security in Israel, because despite having violence at times on the street in Israel, and despite being in a region where there's a lot of tension, and despite being in a place where there's terrorist activity, despite being in an area where almost every Israeli serves in the military and knows how to use a gun, you still don't have a lot of school shootings. Why not? Why? What happened? And so to see it firsthand was really informative for me. So in a typical Israeli school, let's say an elementary school, this is a school that I visited, there is one point of entry. There is an armed guard, and there is a high fence. It is not a playground fence. The fence that I was near went up, let's say, at least a story or two. Now, the kids were playing. They were set back from the fence. And although in that description, you might think, oh, gosh, that sounds horrible. There's a huge fence. Are we just going to gate our kids in? I understand that feeling. In the context of this neighborhood, looks kind of normal because you're around a lot of higher apartment buildings. So there's one point of entry. Parents cannot enter. No one can enter the school unless they have prior permission or they call the school in front of the armed guard, and the school radios the armed guard that they're able to let in. So there's no, hey, I'm Liberty's mom. You've seen me before. There's none of that. It's just a policy. Usually the job of the armed guard is someone that just finished their military service. So Israelis serve just in their late teenage years, going into their early 20s typically. And men and women serve. They're issued weapons, so they know how to use a weapon. And so often this could be a typical job of someone that just finished their military services and trying to figure out what to do next. So they're trained. So this is a single point of entry. This is an armed guard. There are also police officers that make rounds constantly with their lights on, not the sirens, but lights on. So there was a presence. When I was there, the police came by like twice. They were just doing their rounds. So it's this constant vigilance of the school. I was able to speak to a lawmaker because I was curious about gun laws in Israel, especially in a place where almost everybody knows how to shoot a gun because they've been trained, and that is required. It's part of their citizenship. And it's actually very difficult for a private citizen to own a weapon in Israel. There's a process for it. And one of the parts of the process at the time was that once a year, you had to, if you wanted to be what would be comparable to a licensed gun owner, you would have to bring a doctor's note that you had a mental health evaluation, and that that doctor's note was part of your license that you would have to provide. Now, when you think about that, you wonder, well, could there be some sort of like rubber stamping? Like nobody's really, you could have a doctor who's a friend. I don't really know that much more about the process and how it actually works in real time. But that's an interesting part of policy that hasn't necessarily been introduced as an idea here in the United States, although there's been all sorts of, questions about background checks and what to do with existing background checks, what to do to improve background checks, all these different stages of buying a weapon. And depending on what state you live in, buying a gun may look very different. So I share that because it was an unusual idea that I've never actually heard before. And just like we all have to get our cars inspected once a year, is that something that could be considered? And is that something that would be wise or efficient? Remember, Israel is the country somewhere between the size of Delaware and New Jersey. So it's different to look at policy there and try to extrapolate it out to the United States. But obviously, one of the big questions that's being asked is, well, why are these school shootings happening here? What's happening here in the United States? And there's a lot of different theories for that. I'm sure you're having those conversations as well. So I just wanted to share that because it was an unusual experience. The schools were very uniform with their security. It was a very well-known security about how this goes down. No one was trying to work around it. And then it was interesting to note that about private gun ownership in Israel, which is a place that I wouldn't assume that it was difficult to own a gun. I would just assume that people were armed because they were at one time part of the military. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to go over with you today. I know this story hits close to home for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a parent, you're not a parent. It's just one of those stories that hits you in your heart. And there's no way through stories like this than to just drive through the middle of them. And what I hope to do with Smarter News is to provide a place where you can come and get the facts. We will be methodical. We will be sensitive. We will be responsible. We may not be first, but at least you can come and get some information when it works for you, and we can keep you updated on what now is a historic event. There's lots to think about. I'm also getting a lot of calls from family and friends. They're trying to work through it, process it. They have questions about gun laws and clarity. They want clarity. One thing I just want to mention real quick, because this might be helpful over the next few days. A lot of people will throw data at you. Data is great. I love data. Data can also be made to do acrobatics depending on what point of view you want to portray. And that's true of Republican and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. It doesn't really matter. We use data in a way that will support an argument that serves us depending on what point of view you may have. So I like to make sure that with data, we step away and at least show you how it can be used by different sides. One of the things I've experienced with school shootings is that when it comes to school shooting data, sometimes depending on which organization is tracking the data, they will count any discharge of a weapon on school grounds as a school shooting. So let's say someone accidentally discharges a weapon on school grounds. Let's say, this is a darker example, someone commits suicide in a school parking lot. That could be counted as a school shooting depending on the organization that's collecting the data. So it may not be a school shooting like obviously the one that we saw yesterday. And so just be aware of it. Doesn't mean the data is bad. Just something to be aware of when you're looking at different high-profile organizations. Oftentimes in their About section, they will detail what they consider a school shooting, just like we talked about just a couple weeks ago, not even a week ago, actually, when it comes to the definition of mass shootings. Most organizations say it's 4 or more people that are killed in a single incident where it is just the shooting, no other crime taking place. But not every news organization looks at it that way or defines it that way. And so you just being aware of that, I think, is helpful and helps us understand that a lot of the conversations that we're having are moving and evolving too. I'm going to leave you with this. It's something I've been thinking about over the last, actually a couple weeks. It came to me a couple weeks ago. It's something I wanted to share with you. And I feel like right now is a really important time. I've been holding on to this thought because I'm always examining our news coverage, how we can be better, how can we serve you better, what does that actually look like, how can we be different? We're never going to be the 24-hour news station. I don't think you need that anymore. I want to be something different that actually serves you better. And so something that came to my thought was this: faith is not absent from the news. Faith is absent from the press. The press at this time will go after every single expert out there. School security, gun laws, any sort of expert that could lend any sort of voice to this particular story. And one of the voices that won't necessarily be included are the faith leaders in communities around the country. I don't think faith has to be prioritized. When I'm talking about faith, sometimes it can insinuate we're talking about Christianity. I'm talking about any faith. I'm talking about any faith. When we look at the stories over the last 2 years, when we look at our present news cycle over the last 24 hours, how do we organize any information without a little bit of a storyline about faith? I'm not talking about prioritizing it. I'm just talking about including it. Already I'm seeing faith leaders comment all over the country on this particular event. I'm going to look at what they say. And I'd like to collect some of that for you so we can include it in the tapestry of this story. And I think that's important. It's important during this time when the news is so dark, and whatever your faith is, it may give you comfort, but it's part of the story, and faith is part of the story in America. So we shouldn't ignore it. We should include it. Doesn't have to be on center stage, but it should be part of what we're looking through. So I'm thinking a little bit about that. I'd love to know your thoughts on it. In the meantime, I'm going to jump off. I'm going to jump on this press conference, and hopefully we learn a little bit more information. As we get updates, we will update on our website and keep sort of a running timeline as best we can of the events when these updates are notable for you. If you have questions and comments, as always, we welcome them. We're grateful for you. Thank you for being an inspiration, and thank you for allowing us to serve you. It's a privilege during this time, and we appreciate your support so much with Smarter News. I'm very grateful. More on smarternews.com, and I'll see you soon. Bye, guys.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.